Welcome to the Jung Anthology podcast from the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. Pan and the Forest with Ryan Maher. In this episode, Patricia Martin interviews Ryan Maher, MA, LMHC, LCPC, and graduate of the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago's Jungian Psychotherapy program. Listeners may be interested in Ryan's presentation, The Forest, the Witch, and Pan, Psyche's Need for Wilderness and Enchantment, for the Myth Salon on YouTube, which is mentioned in this interview, and a link to that is in the show notes. Ryan Maher is a licensed psychotherapist and graduate of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, where he concentrated his study on the treatment of trauma. Ryan worked with individuals and couples navigating significant life changes, personal and relational conflicts, and feelings of purposeless and lack of meaning. He is a member of the Breathe Network, the National Board of Certified Counselors, and the American Counseling Association. He is also an affiliate member of the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago and presents regularly at the C.G. Jung Center in Evanston, Illinois. More information about Ryan's practice is available at his website, theinnerworldtherapy.com. Okay, now let's jump right in.
Hello, this is Patricia Martin, and I'm your host today for Jungian Anthology. In this episode, we're talking about panic culture and its ancient mythological roots, namely Pan and the Forest. Joining me today as my guest is Ryan Maher. Ryan is a psychotherapist in private practice in Seattle, and he works with adults experiencing anxiety, depression, and relationships concerns. He studied at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, where he got his master's degree. And then he continued his studies at the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago, right here, where he studied Jungian psychology in the Jungian psychology program. He has special training in trauma recovery, and Ryan studies myth, symbols, and archetypes. And he's with us today to share what he knows about panic culture, and the state of the collective. Hi, Ryan. Welcome.
Hi, Patricia. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Now, I should come clean and say you and I were in the JSP JPP program, which is the Jungian Studies program and the Jungian Psychology program. And so we know each other from there. And I was so intrigued. You just gave a talk, a virtual lecture about Pan, the forest, and some of the other archetypes that surround that. So I'm really delighted that you could make it and join us today and talk a little bit more about what the symbolism is. I want to start with, first of all, I want to start with the forest, if we could, because I think that's a really rich setting to place Pan into before we get on to this business of panic culture. So let's start with the forest.
That sounds great. I'm delighted to be here, and I have such fond memories of our time together at the Institute. You're right. The forest is a place of rich symbolism. And I think that at its most essential, the forest is a symbol of the unknown. Mm. And in this way, it's a place of mystery, a place of wonder, which are things that I think a lot of people are longing to connect with today. And as a symbol of the unknown, the forest is also a manifestation of the unconscious. Therefore, it holds great potential for self-discovery, for the journey of individuation. And we see this in myths and fairy tales and folklore, in contemporary culture, through film, literature, I think even video games. Although I'm not steeped in that world, it's my understanding that a lot of video games are set in the forest. I think of the Breath of the Wild, and some other video games. So it's all around us, even at a time when forests are in great need, tangibly, of our attention and our care. So,
yeah, I think that's true, Ryan. I think that, if let's say we're watching a film, if we're going into the forest, something really strange is going to befall us, right? Or befall the main character.
Yes,
right.
That's so true.
Right.
An encounter with a monster, with a witch, with some supernatural power or some chthonic entity that serves a purpose for our own journey. When you're in the forest, you're in for a quest, and a dangerous one oftentimes, one that can feel ominous or scary, but exciting.
Yeah, that was okay. So let's just key off that word exciting for a second, Ryan, because I think that's what Pan is all about. But tell us more about the tradition and the archetypal nature of Pan.
I think a good place to start is with paradox. And if we stay with the symbol of the forest just for a moment longer, something that occurred to me is, and then I think about it often, is it's a place where we can get lost, but we also go to find ourselves. Right? It's a place of renewal, growth, but also decay and decomposition. So there is a paradox here. And when we speak of Pan, we're thrown into this archetype that holds a lot of contradictions, a lot of paradox, and in that regard, there is a lot to teach us. So I think I strayed from your original question though, which was tell us about Pan and who Pan is.
Yeah, I did, but you know what? I now I want to interject something, Ryan, because I've been reading a lot of Western literature recently, and it's so intriguing to me that the 19th century and early 20th century writers, and I'm talking about Tolstoy and James Joyce, and these are the titans of literature, and for them, the forest is alienation. It's about alienation, being alienated from one's knowledge of oneself. So that's where the modern world took it from the ancient roots. And we can maybe circle back to this a little bit later. But I think what's really interesting about what you said is that, when you're in the forest, there is something that is going to befall you. You're going to experience something that's going to be deeply mysterious to you, right? Or deeply unsettling or different, or and so I think that what I'm already hearing is there's something both unsettling and reformative about the setting of the forest. Do I have that right?
Yeah, regenerative. Yes, that's I think so pertinent and salient. And we can see the dissociation in Western thinking that occurs with the forest being the setting of alienation or symbolizing alienation, that Cartesian split and duality. And I think it's important to mention that indigenous cultures don't see it that way. There is not that dichotomous nature that separates us from the earth. And that brings us to Pan, and I think the potential Pan holds for bringing us into closer contact with our own nature internally, and also nature as we might experience it outside. In Greek mythology, Pan was the god of nature, of wilderness. He's also the god of shepherds and the herds that they watched over. And what's interesting about the iconography, the physical traits of Pan is that he has both human attributes, but also animal attributes. He's got these hairy goat legs and hoofs. Sometimes he has horns, but he has the torso of a human and the face most often of a human. And so we can see even in his physical representation, a collision of the animal world, of nature, and the human world.
What is that? I need to kind of stop you for a second, because even as a child, whenever I encountered that man beast archetype, I was always like so puzzled and almost frightened by it. What does it mean? What just that idea alone? What does that mean?
I think it's an expression of our challenge of understanding how do we fit in into this setting of Earth, into the natural world. We're both a part of it, but there's something that can distinguish us from it.
Right. We're of it and we're not.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, thank you. So now I want to ask you kind of a question about what Pan's myth served. Why did he exist in the canon of mythology? What was his job?
A lot of the mythologies that involve Pan bring us into contact with the irrational. Paul Robichaud wrote a book, it was just published last year, called The Great God Pan's Modern Return. And in it, he mentions that both Dionysus and Pan are associated with irrational states of mind. Dionysus with drunkenness and Pan with panic. And we see Pan there at the root of our word panic, pandemonium, pandemic. So the mythologies revolving around Pan are involving this part of our nature that we tend to distance ourselves from, dissociate ourselves from, the non-rational part of our being. And to take that a little bit further, Robichaud describes how othered Dionysus and Pan are in the Greek cosmology. And so there's a unique position where they're a little more distant from the other gods. So when we think of Pan and his mythology, we are in the world of anxiety, of instinct, of nature, of desire. Hillman talks about the twin nuclei of the Pan archetype being anxiety and desire. So we are invited to inquire what is the relationship between these two human experiences, anxiety and desire.
That's fascinating because, all right, so you have me you thinking about it. What is your thoughts on what are your thoughts on that?
I think that there's a kind of regulatory dynamic occurring. We have certain desires to try to abate certain anxieties, and yet when we enact on some desires, we can sometimes intensify our anxieties. And so there's kind of a feedback loop, I think, between these two human experiences.
So it's self-regulatory is what you're really saying. It's a way to regulate it. Too much anxiety around something means probably, on the other hand, maybe your desires have gotten out of control.
Right. And the word regulating might be misconceiving, though, because I don't think it actually helps to bring an individual or a collective into a better relationship with anxiety and desires. They have a way of amplifying each other. So it's maybe more accurate to say it's like a feedback loop rather than regulatory. I know I use that word. However, I think if we imagine it as it's a self-regulatory system, it kind of connotes that it helps with these experiences, but I'm not so sure it does. But if we come into closer contact with Pan, I think there's the potential for moving us into a different relationship with anxiety and desire. And we live in a culture that sells us so much desire, right? And yet anxiety is so ubiquitous and of huge proportions right now.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, Ryan. I'm thinking about we think we're ending or we're tapering out of a pandemic. We've had upheavals that get talked about in a 24/7 news cycle. Everything we're sold is in lights. And, so we live in this hyper anxious world. And I was reading this fascinating research that's come out on how we're adapting in such a way that we can't shut our neurosystem off that would ordinarily, once the panic is gone, we would settle back in to a regular state of being. We're just
Mhm.
staying on. And what are you seeing and what are your thoughts on
Yeah,
where this is taking the collective?
I have a lot of thoughts around this. One salient quality of the Pan mythology that I want to point out is in relation to Pan's instinctual connection. So, how he brings us into contact with our instincts. Well, Carl Jung considered the human ability to reflect as an instinct. And
Mm.
I always thought that was so revolutionary, such a revolutionary way to think about the human capacity to reflect, that it's an actual instinct. And so Pan as a god, as an archetype who embodies the instinctual world, also nudges us toward a reflective attitude. Pan is teaching us not to ignore the non-rational side of ourselves,
Mhm.
including our anxiety, our potential to panic, which really just ends up creating those experiences if we ignore them, but instead to come into contact with them, to acknowledge them, to wrestle with them in an effort to gain greater perspective, more agency, and ultimately more substantial and meaningful transformation. And another piece here to note is Hillman describes Pan as the observer, as the herdsman above the herd. That's so fascinating because we tend to associate Pan as just acting out in a non-rational way, having these desires that are taking control of him. And yet here we see an alternative representation where he is able to gain a higher perspective of the patterns of the tendencies that might be occurring in a flock of sheep or in the human psyche.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, and I think that relates to what you're talking about in terms of what's happening in the collective. You termed it as panic culture. I agree with you 100%. That's where we are right now, and we are subjected to the 24 news cycle. No matter how much we might try to pull ourselves away from it. Maybe if we're living off the grid in Alaska or somewhere,
Right.
you can escape it, but that's not a real viable option for most of us. And I think the consequences of this is fatigue, depression, anxiety, and a pervasive dissociation because it's all too much.
That makes sense. Of course, it would be. And so, as we think about this, the impact of our panic culture, I wonder if there's any way to kind of dial it back. Is the genie out of the bottle, or
Mm.
is this something where you have to be responsible for your own consciousness and your own habits? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think there is a certain responsibility, and not just individual. I think we're really having to think uh, in a way that extends our sense of self to the other. So if we return to Dionysus and Pan as being these gods who are inherently in a more othered position in uh, Greek mythology, we we can appreciate the importance of understanding our own otherness and how we relate to uh, creatures, individuals, aspects of external reality that might be othered.
So I want to kind of go back to the idea of Carl Jung's theory that we are innately seeking as an instinct to reflect. And I think about the timeline that Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud were working. Carl Jung was out giving, reading, writing, giving lectures on mythology, and Sigmund Freud was out giving lectures on the Oedipus complex. And I think Jung knew fair well. When you read his biography, he knew full well that where this was going. That this was, two paths separating.
Mhm.
And so it was, but I think in taking the choice to look at mythology, it was a very specific choice for Carl Jung. He was embarking on something. What do you think he was after when he really kind of devoted his adult professional life to studying symbols and archetypes and myth?
I think he was after meaningfulness, a way to understand the ineffable. And myth has the potential to communicate realities that aren't easily captured by language or words. The images, the fantastical stories of myth can transport us into a way of thinking that's not linear and is much more expansive. And so I also think of Jung as the empiricist, eager to understand human nature and going about this in a very pragmatic way,
Mhm.
which is contrary to how a lot of people conceptualize Jung. Jung the mystic, Jung, this collective unconscious. What's that? He was so pragmatic, and we see that in the word association test. We see that in his whole way of thinking, and that when he was really honest with himself, he had to admit that there are so many aspects to experience that are unexplainable, unknowable. We can get closer to knowing, and I think he saw myth as a very effective way of doing that.
I also wonder sometimes if you're right. He was a scientist. And he was trained as a doctor, so he brought that mind to the business. And I think you're right. We overlook it because I think we're still trying to make meaning, existential meaning, out of what is the purpose of man and woman, and I don't mean that as biogender, but what is our human purpose on the
Mhm,
planet?
mhm.
And I think some of what you talk about with Pan, it makes a great deal of sense, but I also know that Pan had a special place in the canon in that I believe he's the only god who really died. I mean,
Yeah.
gods are immortal, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So what does that mean?
Well, I think some of the significance of that is he died when the Industrial Revolution was really underway. His death meant that we could extract resources from the planet in a way that's not sustainable. The God of nature died. The one God in the Greek uh, you know, uh, cosmology dies.
Interesting.
The one God who does die is the God of nature, a defender of wild animals, the God of the wilds, who
Mhm.
resides at the edge or far beyond human civilization. So we have a displacement of the earth as possessing this sacredness, enchantment, and the rise of uh, human society in a way that was dissociated from the planet. And I think that's ultimately what Pan's death was about, at least in one perspective. And there's a great quote by Hillman. He he says, when Pan is dead, then nature can be controlled by the will of the new god, man, modeled in the image of Prometheus or Hercules,
Mhm.
creating from it and polluting in it without a troubled conscience.
It's very useful to off Pan in order to, but I think also I wonder as well if you know the rise of a new culture that was maybe more based on um, a few organized religions. There's a cultural conflict, and I think you see that the pagan was a problem,
Yes.
right? And so some of it had to be eradicated. And what's so interesting to me is that also Pan being the god of our instincts, is we have also been disassociated from our instincts. I mean,
Yes.
people have to work very hard. People go into training to reconnect themselves to their own instincts. I find that fascinating.
That's so true, Patricia. Their own bodies, there becomes a shame around the instinctual side of our being, in
Right.
such an intense shame that we dissociate from it. We disconnect from it. That's not us. And then the tendency for that to manifest in other ways that are creating anxiety
Mhm.
or increased amounts of shame.
Yeah, it's only bound to generate more neuroticism because
Uh-huh.
you're overlooking something that is innate in you. And it kind of brings us back to where we started, where, you've got Pan as the half god, half goat. And,
Mhm.
we are half animal and half human. I mean, on some level, we're primates. And so I wanted to kind of wrap this up with a view to the future. Do you see us as a culture coming to a place where we're able to sort of right size the culture instead of this hyperbolic, larger than life, internet generated culture? Do you ever see a place where human beings will reclaim their instincts, reclaim their forest, whether that be mythological or real? What's your vision?
I hope so. I think it's important to remember, Pan, that this is calling us, the various crises, socially, ecologically, is calling us to remember a foundational part of ourselves, the instinctual, our relationship to the natural world. And so I think our survival depends on it, ultimately. Um, I think we have a hope or a tendency, I find myself sometimes thinking this, that a new technology will save us. If we can find a way to capture carbon from the atmosphere and put it underground, and maybe that'll be the case. But that occurring at the exclusion of a deeper relationship with our animal nature, our instinctual side, I don't think that's going to get us to where we ultimately need to be. There
Just
was something you mentioned too that I thought was very interesting: hyperbole, the internet, and that brings us into Hermes' realm, who was Pan's father in one of the mythologies. And Hermes is this, right, a trickster god, the god of messages. And so, what kind of messages are we connecting with? Are we receiving
Mhm.
misinformation, too much information? Hermes is very, very constellated alongside Pan, I think.
Mhm.
Don't mean to take us to open a door to another subject matter here, but that came to mind as well.
Maybe you're opening the door to another conversation, Ryan, that we can have again.
I
It's
would
been a
love that.
delight to have you on Jungian Anthology, and I ask everyone this question as we wrap up: what's next for Ryan Maher?
Well, right now I'm working on writing an article that I hope to publish uh, pertaining to what we've talked about today. So I'm still diving into Pan, nature, psyche. And I'm also really eager to research and explore more fully how we understand depth psychology as a very effective way to helping and treating trauma. I think
Mm.
there's not a lot of appreciation for how efficacious depth psychologies are in the trauma world, and you don't really see much of it in the trauma literature. So I'm eager to engage with that.
What a great professional mission, Ryan. Congratulations on your work. We'll post some links to your practice and to your lecture on Pan, because I'm sure people will want to really actually click in and listen to everything you had to say about the forest and Pan and some of the other archetypes. It's been wonderful to have you, and we look forward to having you back again to talk maybe about Hermes and maybe about another god.
Oh, I would love that. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you. It was great.
It was.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like more information about training programs, archives, this podcast, or to find a Jungian analyst near you, visit our website, jungchicago.org. Thank you to our 2021 donors who gave at the contributing member level or above: the Arlene M. Feiner Trust, Barbara Annan, Arlo and Rena Compaan, Judith Cooper, Kevin Davis, George J. Didier, Mary Dougherty, Carl and Patricia Gree, Ryan Maher, Patricia Martin, Boris Matthews, Sue Rosenthal, Diane Sherwood, Debbie Stutzman, Lawrence Chad Tingley, Alexander Wayne and Lynn Kopp, Gerald Weiner, and Ellen Young. You can also become a supporter of this podcast by visiting our website, jungchicago.org. Thanks.